All right. Thank you so much, folks, for coming out on this beautiful Saturday afternoon in downtown Santana. My name is Gustavo Arellano. I'm a columnist for the Los Angeles Times. But for today's purpose, I am the husband of the owner of Alta Baja Market. So yes, round of applause for Delilah, who's busy working there. My wife, Delilah Snell, owns it. Alta Baja Market is a market that celebrates the border in all of its beauty, not the stupidities that some politicians say is down there in the border. Get yourself a michelada, but we're also going to be catering afterwards. There's going to be cornbread, what else? Cornbread, guacamole, a whole bunch of goodies. But today, you're not here to talk. You're not here to hear me. You're here to hear this guy. But first, we have to do some thanks. Thank you to the UCI School of Social Ecology. You should all, I think half of you work for that place. So thank you all for coming out on your what's supposed to be your relaxing day instead of working. But UCI School of Social Ecology was smart enough to do something with this guy who I'm going to be introducing in a little bit. All these books, those of you who registered, you get a free copy of the book. First come, well, the people who registered first, afterwards we'll figure out who gets it. Who was the donor, the kind person who made all of this happen, Mike?
Yeah, I want to say thank you to Todd Priest, Public Affairs, a longtime Orange County public affairs professional with a great firm in practice. I called him, he immediately said, yeah, I want to help, I want to be helpful. So he said, let's just buy some books for people that want to show up, and here they are.
Is Todd Priest Jimmy? Where's Jimmy's? Are they one of the evil ones? No? Okay, so Todd Priest is one of the good ones.
We were all evil together in the 90s, and we have since left. I actually, so all the three of us have transformed into something new.
Well, isn't that wonderful? And who am I talking to, and why are we here today? We're here because of this, how can I describe this? Insightful, incisive, very well written, which you rarely see in political memoirs, and especially pieces just about political analysis. The book is called The Latino Century: How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. And the author, of course, is this guy right here, but I'm going to read the bio that, who wrote it, you or your publicist?
My publicist.
Of course, because I would love to see how Mike would describe himself. But Mike Madrid is a veteran American political consultant, one of the country's authoritative experts on Latino voters, and a co-founder of the Lincoln Project, a graduate of Georgetown University. I don't know too many Mexicans who have gone to Georgetown.
There weren't many then, and there aren't many now.
Yeah, they all go to American University, right?
Yeah, they all. Yeah, or worse, yeah.
Yeah. If we get too insider when we talk, just let us know and we'll make it more mainstream. But otherwise, I'm just going to talk like this. A graduate of Georgetown University, he served as a press secretary for the California Assembly, Republican leader, as the political director for the California Republican Party, and a senior advisor to both Democrats and Republicans. He is a partner in Grassroots Lab, a political consulting firm in California. Round of applause for our guest here today, Mike Madrid. And unless it's your familia or friends, Mike, they're not here to see you. They're here because they are desperate to know the question that has been, vexing politicos, everyone for the past 40 years, especially this election. How are Latinos going to vote in the presidential election in this year, 2024? And what's your answer?
I can tell you the exact percentage of the vote that Donald Trump will get. How's that work?
Let's do that.
35%.
35%, and I see some people secretly smiling. I see some people saying, what the hell is going on? And our sign just dropped, but that's okay. And why have people been so obsessed about Latinos and how they vote and what party they're joining? Especially, I would say, definitely within your lifetime.
Well, the main reason is the size of the vote has gotten a lot larger than when I was first looking at this in the early 90s. I think you hadn't been born quite yet in the early 90s. But back then, when you talk about the Latino voter, it was just California, Florida, Texas, a little bit of New York. Now the Latino voter will be larger than the margin of victory in every single one of the swing battleground states. So we can't say, Latinos will be the decisive vote, but we can't say that we won't be the decisive vote either. And the nature of who Latino voters is changing too. And that's, I think, what's really kind of perplexed people is it's the media and the politicians themselves really have this desperate need to define who we are, especially as people that are ethnically not white people. They're like, this is, what are you? What is the issue? What's the silver bullet? How do we talk to you? What Spanish language slogan is going to be like the Pied Piper that magically brings you all to the voting booth? And of course, all of these stereotypes are, while they're easily debunked, they're kind of hard to break down in American culture. We have this need to kind of make, especially people who are not of a white European culture, something exotic, something peculiar, something unique, something a little less informed, less nuanced, less sophisticated. And so, we talk about, WhatsApp channels in Spanish, or maybe it's the machismo that's making everybody turn into a Trumper, or the support of the caudillo, the Latin American strongman. And you're talking to people that are third generation that don't speak Spanish or have never been outside of the U.S. borders, whose Latino identity is just as legitimate as those who have naturalized and became citizens this year. So we're becoming more complex. At the same time, the country's transformation is desperately trying to figure out who the hell we are and what's going on to the country.
35%, was that around what George W. Bush got in 2004? So right about that. 35%? No.
George W. got 37% in 2000, race I was involved with, highest ever at the time. And then in 2004, he broke 40% during the re-elects with John Kerry. The 9/11 stuff was still fresh, and it was kind of a country at war, so there was clearly a rally around the flag effect. Trump is sitting at a higher range now, historically, than most Republicans, but George W. and Reagan both broke that number.
Why do so many people get upset at the idea of Latinos even considering voting for Donald Trump, a man who started his presidential career by saying Mexico is sending over rapists and drug dealers, and some of them, I guess, are okay people, trying to build a border wall, blah, 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 blah. Why do people get upset?
Well, we only have an hour here, right? So we've got to be really brief in what we're saying. But, I mean, look, we're in very partisanized times, and there's no undecided voters, really. People know where they're at. Some are with Donald Trump, some are with Kamala Harris, or we're with Biden, or whoever. The Democrats could have put up a doorknob, and they'd be with the doorknob and saying, we're never Trump, never going to vote for Donald Trump. I think the biggest reason, though, is because this is a man who clearly articulates. I'll be diplomatic, and then I'll let you be a little bit more cabron and say it directly. White nativist sentiment. This is somebody who's clearly appealing to some of the darker angels of our nature, and has continually. And that, I think, really perplexes people. It's like, how can this be happening, especially, again, in a country where our media, our academia, our political leaders have really desperately worked to define us as a racial and ethnic minority with a traditional sense of a racial and ethnic minority mindset. So you can't vote any differently. Or as Joe Biden famously said, if you aren't voting for me, are you even black? Right? And that's Joe Biden. And that is the mentality of an older Democratic Party. I'm seeing that change, obviously, with the new candidacy, but that is something we have to pay attention to and listen to, because that comes from a place that frankly is legitimate. For most of our history as a country, we've been an 85% white European nation. I mean, with all the nuances of the indigenous and slaves and Mexicanos, all of which are at the founding documents of those three groups specifically. And I'm not, of course, dismissing any of that, but just for purposes of kind of moving forward with the conversation, our whole understanding of what being an American is comes largely through Western European roots. Overwhelmingly has always looked west as the frontier, and as we become a non-European people who are looking north for frontier, it's changing our whole conceptualization of where we came from, what our histories were, what it means to be American. And there's half the country is optimistic and excited and intrigued by it, and the other half is deathly frightened, afraid, and hates it.
And so you're saying, it's literally in the title, that Latinos are going to be the transformative group that in many ways, I don't know if you want to say saves democracy, or at the very least buttresses it in a way that the white population, the traditional white population, definitely does not, or doesn't want to anymore.
Yeah, look, the book is is actually very optimistic, and it didn't start out that way. So it was about 2/3 of the way through it, and I was like, holy shit, this is actually Mike Madrid's writing something optimistic about something good happening here. The main argument that I'm making is that we are in this really troubling place as a country for demographic reasons. And by that, what I mean is those that are over the age of 60 years old have a very deeply negative view of the United States of America currently and where it's headed. In fact, it's the most negative view of this country of any generation ever polled, ever in modern history. But those under 30 have a very optimistic view of who we are and where we're going and what the country is becoming. And that argument, or that dichotomy, I kind of explain as the difference between pluralism and tribalism. And pluralism is if you are confident and feel good about a changing, diverse country and saying this is going to be good for us and who we are. It's more true to the idea of what American mythology has always said we are. Anybody can come to America and become American. And then those that really believe that, no, maybe that's not true. That was easy to say when we were 85% white. But as whites drop below 50% in the next 15 years or so, there's a lot of hesitance, there's a lot of concern, a lot of consternation that maybe these are people who, eat pets. Maybe these are people who, aren't really civilized like we are. And when you're in Des Moines, Iowa, and you see Joe's hardware store that's been there for 70 years become the Alta Baja market, there's like, what does this mean? Like
cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance. There's this break between the idea and the mythology of what we've always told ourselves we were as an America, as a country where, e pluribus unum and everybody can come here and be American. But then when it actually starts to happen and our complexion actually changes, it's like, whoa. I didn't mean really happen. I just meant like it's a good idea and concept. And so that's really the struggle with where we're at right now. And there's Latinos who are reinvigorating that freshness, that belief in the American idea. It's not just our blended culture, which I argue, which is better constituted for a multiracial America. It's because we just have this overwhelming strength and optimism about all of our institutions. If you poll Latinos, they're like, we've got higher levels of trust in our school system, with the police, with the military, with the government, with the media. And I think that comes from a more communal perspective of looking to and relying on one another as part of our cultural heritage, as opposed to those who may have come from a Western European background, which relies foundationally on the perspective of the success of the individual and yourself, and making sure that you are pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, where we're like, it doesn't matter how well you do unless you're bringing your familia up, your community up, and todos up, and that's a very different perspective.
You saying earlier, like, Mike Madrid's an optimist, and saying it as something surprising. I've always thought of you like you've always been trying to push, not so much trying to push, but trying to tell people like this is, if you want to reach Latinos, who by the way are this incredible political demographic, and both parties, but especially since you were a Republican for so long, the Republican Party is totally messing up on. I think of that as you looking optimistically at the future of the United States, if not necessarily on the institution. So most of your book, I would say probably the first 60% of it is really about your family's history, how you got to that. And the first question, I want you to talk about your own family history, but the first question I have, can we really trust someone about Latinos in the United States? Can we really trust a Latino from Moore Park to have this insight? People don't even know where Moore Park is.
That's the main reason why you can trust it. But there's a unique little dynamic about Moore Park that I think makes me a uniquely situated person to write this book. Moore Park is a little small community right smack dab in the middle of Ventura County. When I was growing up in the 80s and through the 90s, it had the distinction of being the only city in California that had a declining Latino population. So I had, my family moved there in 1971, the year that I was born, moved out of Echo Park to literally the end of the freeway at the time, out to the orchards, apricot orchards. Moore Park is the name of a type of apricot. Moved out to apricot orchards. It was a city of about 2,500 people, overwhelmingly Latino. And then the 80s suburban sprawl started to kind of build around it with wealthier, whiter homes around it. So I had to learn to not only navigate, my own understanding of my own ethnicity, my own culture, but every year that I was going to school, it would get whiter and wealthier while we were not. And California, of course, outside of my small city, was becoming more Latino, which was kind of reinforcing some of those. So understanding how to navigate and nuance all of that, I think made me a better political consultant, frankly. But I also think it gave me a very different and unique perspective. I immediately became a Republican at 18. My family was all Democrats.
Why?
I believe that I equated economic success with the GOP, and I was intrigued by the idea that we needed, and look, the truth of the matter is, I think a lot of it had to do with I was seeing my poor Mexican community, overwhelmingly Democrats, being swallowed up by this wealthier white Leviathan, which was more Republican. And I was like, I want to be rich. I don't want to be a poor Mexican. And that's just honest and raw and painful, and it's a struggle. But I know that I wasn't alone in that. That is the aspirational middle class story that has driven virtually every group to do something different. And so I watched my mother's family leave the urban core. Not all of them. Some of my cousins lived and stayed there. And I think the perspective of ethnicity and identity was distinct from my sisters and some of my cousins, but other cousins who had different experiences, you can see that lean into our ethnicity and why. And I was taking notes, copious notes about all of this, because it was telling me a lot about who our people were, what was happening to the state, and ultimately when I went back east to school, I could see the numbers were going to change over my lifetime, that America was going to change into something dramatically different than it had ever been before. And when I went there in the early 90s, the only discussion about racial or ethnic politics was literally about black and white. Like, people didn't know. I went to school with a lot of people that had never met a Mexican American before, never met Latinos before. And so when, it was a very vibrant intellectual community in Washington, D.C., the political center of the world. But there were no discussions about Latinos, Hispanics. It was all about the black and white relationship.
You come back to California, you work in the Republican Party at one of the most consequential eras in California history, the 1990s, the rise of a Republican Party that really cast its lot on passing Prop 187, which made life miserable for undocumented people, Prop 209, which banned affirmative action, Prop 227, which ended bilingual education, started by a teacher here in Santana Unified, by the way, Gloria Mara-Tuckman. How was it being a Latino Republican during that time? How many times did you get called a vendido?
That's a great question, because I got called a vendido, I don't want to say daily, but weekly. But I was told to go back to the country I came from daily by the Republicans. So the Republicans were saying, you're not really American, and Latinos were saying, you're not really Latino. And so I know there's going to be tough questions from the audience. That's okay. I'm fully prepared for that. I've been living it my whole life. I'm not afraid of it. But both of those sides are wrong. And I think we're finally, now that I'm a man in my 50s, seeing in America where people are coming to that realization that that's just such a crass oversimplification. And I think that's probably been a lot of your experience too, in a lot of ways.
So how did you justify to yourself, if you're getting called more, if you're hearing it more from the Republicans, go back to Mexico, how did you justify for yourself working for the Republican Party, especially during the 90s? Obviously it changes with the Bush era, but during that particular time.
The way I like to answer a question like that is by saying, I'm an American, and with all of our deep, ugly flaws and history, I still deeply love this country for what it says that it stands for and what it fights to continually be. I am a Catholic, and despite the ugly, horrible histories of the Catholic Church, I still love what it pronounces and aspires to be. The same thing with my political beliefs. And that's where principle matters. The more we stand up for what we proclaim to be, despite our human failings, the better human beings we are. We're not perfect people. We're not a perfect society. We're not a perfect country. But what makes us more perfect is accepting the flaws of who we are and working to fix them and move forward. And that's my nationality, that's my religion, that's my political beliefs, that's as deeply flawed as I am as a man, as a human being, that's what I try to be.
And you talk about this in your book. You talk about how you try to tell the California Republicans, dudes, and yes, dudes, like, get your act together. You're not seeing what's coming that's going to screw you folks over. Then you start working for the George W. Bush campaign, which did listen to that. And that's where you did get those historical gains with Republican presidential candidates, which you mentioned earlier. He had 37% of the vote, 2004, he gets, 40%, a little bit over 40%. And at this point, we're still talking very much about Texas and California. What is changing in the United States during the 2000s and 2010s where people, both parties start realizing, like, okay, we can't talk, when we talk about minority politics, we need to start including Latinos now into this?
That's a great question. And a big part of my early career was focused on why has Texas figured it out and California has not? When we typically think that California's got these more progressive, inclusive values, why are they heading in the Pete Wilson direction and Texas was heading in the George W. Bush direction and getting over 50% of Latino votes in Texas? And so a big part of the first part of my career was reconciling this. I even went to go work for a firm in Texas because the Texas Republicans were doing it right. Well, now it's the party of Greg Abbott and Ted Cruz, right? So
Latino.
Yeah, a Latino, the Cuban, right? Canadian Cuban, which is an interesting variety, right? We're gonna have Canadian Cuban micheladas too, right? Served after this, called the Ted Cruz. Have them, they're great. At least Gustavo loves them. Yeah. Anyway, but both parties, change as they do, and that's why I always like people who are so dug in with their party right now. It's so peculiar to me where people like put so much virtue in their party and their identity. It's like these parties don't give a shit about you. They're just vessels to move interests along, and those interests change. The Republican Party of today is profoundly different than it was 150 years ago. It's profoundly different than it was when Reagan and Bush were, running for re-election in 1984. Like, completely different. It was against Russia then. It was against tariffs and taxes then. It was against, I can go on and on and on. These parties have changed. That's what parties do. And I think the inflexibility of who we are as a people now, especially in the age of social media, when we're so used to getting everything that we want when we want it delivered, on, Uber Eats for $40 for like a salad or whatever we're paying to do that, has led us to this place where our politics kind of don't make sense, because unless you're with me 100% of the time, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And I say that because I can tell you specifically the moment when the Republican Party changed from believing that we could be an expansive, broader, diverse, permanent majority party, which is the party that I was very deeply involved and engaged with. And that moment was when the first plane hit the first tower on 9/11. Because 9/11 transformed us as a country. It made us much more fearful. It made us much more inwardly focused. We were scared. We're still scared. And fear changes the nature of who you are, and it profoundly changed the Republican Party towards a more isolationist, protectionist, nativist party.
Yet you stayed with the Republican Party until Donald Trump. You stayed with Pete Wilson, you stayed with the Iraq War, you stayed with Mitt Romney, whatever the hell he was. What was it about Trump that made you say, you know what, I'm done with this party? I've tried to work from the inside. I've given most of my adult career to this, but no more, no mas.
Well, there's two pieces of rationale. The first you've outlined right, like how can you stick with a party that is changing underneath you? But the other is, what is the alternative? And as much as I was losing my Republican sensibilities, I knew damn well I was not a Democrat for the same reason I always knew it.
Why?
Because I would have regular, and by regular I mean every night, discussions with my family saying, if you continue these policies that you're advocating for, our community is going to be poorer, it's going to be more difficult to get housing, our schools are going to be worse, there's going to be more Latinos in prison, there's going to be more poverty, you're creating an economic disparity through these policies that are going to be very harmful to our community. And I got the microphone.
Well, you're doing your Trump moment now.
And that's exactly where California is today. Okay? So, look, I have more than most in this country sacrificed my career, put my personal life in jeopardy, the lives and security of my children, because of my political beliefs and stepping out against Donald Trump. But that doesn't mean that suddenly like, oh, okay, you go from one side to the other. It means that my beliefs are as firm now as they always have been. And just because the Republican Party has morphed into something unrecognizable to me does not mean that the Democratic Party is necessarily a better policy solution, although it does meet the criteria for me that it's better than dealing with the existential threat of what Donald Trump presents.
What are these policies that you were talking about?
Oh, get comfortable, sit down. I mean, the reform of our K through 12 system, first and foremost, our housing policies. The Democratic Party eliminated the one tool local elected officials had, redevelopment, tax increment financing, to actually provide affordable housing for the least among us, which is very important to me from my own Catholic tradition. And what happened the year that they eliminated redevelopment funding so that the labor unions could get $1.5 billion a year in financing, you start to see an explosion of homelessness on the streets. Now, I'm not saying this is the only reason, but there's a direct correlation between providing money for your political allies and having people live in squalor and that desperately need our help living on the streets of California. Homelessness is a national problem, but it is exponentially worse in this state, and that's one of the main reasons. That was a horrible policy, a horrible thing to do, but I could go on and on. If you walk away with any data point for the future, I want you to walk away with this. 70% of Latino children in California are on Medi-Cal. That is a sin in a state that has the wealth and the economy for those that are making money and have high-tech skills and are employed in more advanced industries. To have 70% in a poverty program for basic health needs is there's a direct line between that and the collapse of an economy for working class people. And that is there is no good answer to that. And again, I don't have time for partisanship. I worked for Antonio Villaraigosa. You famously called him a Chicanosaurus, which I think is hilarious. But I will work for a Democrat who's willing to stand up against his party. I will absolutely call amongst my dearest friends Republicans who will stand up to call out the bad stuff that's happening in the Republican Party. But my journey has told me that is the only way we are going to fix what is wrong with us, is to get people out of this broken mindset that somehow their parties are inherently more virtuous than the enemies on the other side. And Latinos are the one demographic where we are seeing them respond to that message the most.
If these policies in California done by Democratic lawmakers are so disastrous for Latinos, why do these Democratic Latinos keep winning in California? Then I'll follow it up to make it national.
That's a wonderful question, and it's one I've done a lot of research on because me, being so smart, decided to leave Washington, D.C. as a young man to answer the questions as to which way we were going to go. As I mentioned, there was a contrast with Texas in terms of policy and politics. I was pushing very hard for us to follow that George W. Bush direction, a positive, aspirational, multi-ethnic, working class agenda. What we found was once the Republican Party was essentially eviscerated in this state 30 years ago, we started moving in a dramatically different direction. Virtually every indicator has gotten worse and worse and worse. And the short answer to your question is there's threefold. The first is we are much more recently migrated as Californians than any other state in the union. 1 in 4 foreign-born Americans live in California. Part of that is just we're so enormous, by the way. But all economic immigrants, starting back from when we kept records back at Ellis Island 150 years ago, vote with the Democratic Party 70% plus of the time. There are political exceptions like the Cubans, the Vietnamese here in the OC, now the Venezuelans, But they were political refugees that voted against communism and socialism, that voted with the Republicans. Everybody else votes with the Democratic Party. So that's the main reason. That is changing, by the way. Latino registrations are exploding towards Republicans and declining, just moving away from the Democratic Party in every Assembly, Senate, and Congressional district in California now. We were behind everybody else. So that's the first reason. The second is we have very, very bad numbers of economic mobility. If you're Latino in California, you're much more likely to be poor than in any other state in the union, largely because of housing prices. And then you can't dismiss that there's been a political polarization, at least generationally, with Prop 187, 227, 209, all those measures that you mentioned. But I would say this, I'm sorry about all the nerdiness here. The book is really a lot easier to read than listening to me on all of this stuff. Proposition 187, how many people remember Proposition 187? It was 30 years ago. 40% of Latinos are under the age of 30. 40%, meaning 40% of Latino voters weren't even alive during Proposition 187. They have no living memory of it. And so we're witnessing something very different, very transformational, that is going to change our whole conceptions of what minority voters are. That background music was by design, by the way.
The Rancho Libertarians are coming in. You missed a part where, and I've written about this, where the Democrats have been writing this Republicans are evil 187 for 30 years, and it did. And I saw, where did I say? Oh, Capital Maine. You got interviewed, and you a really great progressive website. You said something to the effect that, I'm paraphrasing here, that anti-immigrant politics don't make Latinos vote Democrat. I think it did for 20 years. And then for the past generation or so, as you mentioned, as you have younger people, it's kind of petered out. And I think now Latinos really don't care. Polls have shown that Latinos are more against illegal immigration now than they ever have been. Is that so? On that point, but also wanted to let you say a little bit more. If more Latinos are going Republican, even here in California, or if not Latinos, at least ditching the Democratic Party, what are the reasons?
So there's like 4 questions there, so my memory's getting bad, so just remind me what I miss. Let me say this. There was in 1994, let me tell you an old tale from an old guy who's been doing this for a while. Back in 1994, Latinos were 11% of the electorate in California. 30 years later, we're about 23%. It's not that big. 30 years later, everyone thinks it's like 70%. It's like, no, it's like 23%. Ask Antonio Villaraigosa, you can't even win a Democratic primary in this state on the Latino vote. So it's just not that consequential mathematically. It's big, but it's got to be put in perspective. That's important because we as a community, Latinos, have the lowest voter registration and turnout rates of any race or ethnicity in the country and in the state. And I'm arguing that's a function of everybody talking about an issue that we have been telling pollsters for 3 decades is 5 or 6 on our list. It's not jobs. Immigration is 5 or 6 on our list. It's not that important, but so desperate is the need to characterize the fact that all of us, first, second, third, and now 4th generation Latinos are like waking up in the middle of the night afraid of ICE and being deported, it's just not a relatable argument. And so that's a big part of it. And so what happens is Latinos are just like, my life isn't getting better. The economy is maybe improving around me, but it's not getting better for my community. We know that quantifiably over decades. But all these guys want to talk about, and it's largely been guys, but not more recently, men and women, politicians and the media, who just want to keep talking about kids in cages and building a border wall, and it fans the flames. What's the word am I looking for? Fans the flames. Yeah, it fans the flames of social division. It keeps your eyeballs glued to the cable TV, and get more likes on Twitter using that, I guess. But it's not the reality of where our community has been. And our response is always from some Latino political consultant like, oh, it's because we don't spend enough telling our community what we want, which is basically like, give me more money and I'll solve the problem. Which, look, I've made a good living as a political consultant. I understand it. That's what we do. But it doesn't mean, got a nice watch, thanks. Yeah, but it doesn't mean that it's true. And it's never been true. We have always had lower turnout rates, but I believe that they're more demographic and political in nature than they are like give a consultant a lot of money and they'll solve your problem for you.
So, okay, again, transformational, you said Latinos here in California. That's a very abysmal stat, by the way. That's terrible. 22% of the turnout, or rather, of the electorate and that. So where are Latinos going to, are Latinos going to be the swing vote in this election? If you said at the very beginning, you're predicting Trump's going to get 35% of the Latino vote, is that going to make the difference to be able to get him elected back to the White House? Or again, I know I asked a lot of questions at the same time, but will Latinos be that swing vote both for the presidential election but also local elections?
Well, it's going to be determinative, and we'll have a record number of Latino elected officials this year. The question really becomes what happens with, and we've never really characterized it this much, but you're going to hear this term from now forever, what is the white vote going to do? How much is the white working class and the white college-educated vote going to split and be different? The diploma divide, which is really the biggest issue driving American politics, has people with college degrees moving decidedly towards the Democratic Party, those without moving just as fast to the Republican Party. So we're becoming partisanized by whether or not you have a college degree or not. Latinos are the fastest growing group of non-college educated voters, which is why we're becoming more Republican. Our jobs tend to be in the construction industry, on the energy patch, it's blue collar, it's on the assembly line, the manufacturing line, it's in those professional classes, or like a realtor or a mortgage broker. Industry, by the way, which has been particularly hard hit over the past 3 or 4 years with interest rates going up the way that they have and inflation eating up the dollar. A lot of Latino families out there have been just hit in the gut by the economy that we're dealing with, and you just hear from the administration, the S&P is doing great, all the economic indicators are doing great, inflation's better, Bidenomics is fine, and working class people are like, what world are you living in? Like, this is tough. So I think that 35% number, give or take a point or two, will that be determinative by itself? No, but it is a historically strong position for Republicans to be at in September before an election in November. That's news enough. And I say that because you're going to see over time more and more moving towards the Republican Party, or at least away from the Democratic Party. And I'll wrap up the question on this. There are 2 American politicians in this country who have defied both the polling numbers and conventional wisdom on Latino voters. The first is Donald Trump, who we're talking about. The second was Bernie Sanders on the left. And a lot of those movements happened literally in the same precincts, in the same communities, the same neighborhoods. That's a sign of populism, that they're rejecting both parties. The candidate that speaks the most against their party and against the system is attracting a lot more Latino support, which is something we need to really pay attention to. And that's why it's happening. I don't believe that Latinos are suddenly becoming more conservative and suddenly like, well, I used to be pro-choice, now I'm pro-life, or I used to be, for gay marriage, now I'm against it, or, I've changed on tax policy. That's not at all what it is. What it is people are saying both of these parties are full of shit, and I'm not buying it anymore. And they've kind of been saying, we have, as a community, we have kind of been saying that for 30 years by just not voting. By just saying, well, there's literally no point. If I vote for the dominant party, what's going to happen? My life is going to get better? We know for 30 years that's not true. It's just not true. And yet I'm not going to vote for those guys who are using me as a scapegoat for all the solutions that they're not going to solve. So what am I left to do except believe what you're telling me, which is, I'm not going to fix your problems. I'm going to keep telling you that you should be worried about the issues that I'm telling you and ignore all of these other issues that are really at the top of your mind.
One word answer. Who's going to win in November?
Harris is going to win.
There you go. Work. Boo. More boos. Come on, I want to hear more boos. Who's voting for Alfred Newman here? Raise your hand. Me and Matt. We're the only ones. Okay. We're going to get to your questions a little bit. I just want to talk a little bit, though, about your time here in Orange County. You are a fellow for the School of Social Ecology. Yeah. As part of that, you've done this really great podcast talking about Red County, Orange County, Purple County. That's the name. You should all listen to it. What fascinates you so much about Orange County politics that brought you here to do this.
And just so everybody knows, full disclosure, I have consciously stayed out of Orange County politics my entire adult career. This is true. Even as the political director of the California Republican Party, when this was the heart of Republican politics, because the politics are just a different, personal, kind of nasty sort of, you guys fight serious here. I'm like, I don't even have a stomach for that. Like, you all fight it out and tell me what happened. But there's something very extraordinary happening in Orange County right now. And that is, we are seeing a rise in the number of non-white college graduates that are also reshaping the contours of what I wrote about and what we've been talking about in the country. So as much as this book is kind of for the first time putting out the racial and ethnic overtones to the diploma divide, even now there are in a few select counties in the country, Orange County being the main one, where we're seeing something even newer and more fascinating unfold. And I want to be part of that. There's a dedication by Dean Gould and the school, which the School of Social Ecology, by the way, is fascinating and unique in and of itself because they're practitioners. They're not just academics writing research papers and 3 of your colleagues read it and then it goes away. When they talk about prison reform, they're in prisons. Like they're researching but actually doing stuff. That was intriguing to me. Like I want to be part of that. So okay, let's talk, and it's been great. But Orange County really is, in more ways than California is, giving us some really keen insight on what the country's going to be dealing with in the next 15, 20 years. And that's the main reason. Plus, the weather's not bad, and there's good food at Alta Baja, so.
He's never been here. Oh, no, we did. Well, that's right. One time. Okay, if you folks want to ask questions, please line up here. I'm going to turn on the mic. I'm going to ask one more question, a very inside baseball OC question. We're here in Santana, one of the most Latino big cities in the United States. Yeah. The city council is majority Latino. It's a burner city council. Very, very progressive city council. You go up the 5 freeway, we're in Anaheim, my hometown. Also a Latino majority city council, but the Latinos there, they're Democrats, but they're very, very moderate to the point where they gave a sweetheart deal to Disneyland. In your studies and all that, what do you think ultimately determines how Latinos go politically, given that example, even if they're next to each other? And you see in LA, you go more La Puente is more conservative than say Los Angeles. So what does that determine? Inland Empire more conservative, blah, blah, blah. What determines that?
The first thing that determines it is generational differences. This is the foundational argument of the book. Those that are recently migrated have a very distinct set of political views from their children, that second generation cohort. But the movement from second to third generation is pretty tectonic. And that third generation tends to be, not always, but tends to be where you're seeing more burners. I don't know if this is the case in Santana. More people voting Bernie Sanders and more Donald Trump, more populist. Most of the people that have served in California during my era, from 1994 to basically 2020, were all second generation. Every Latino politician's speech for 30 years started off with, "I'm the son or I'm the daughter of immigrants." And that became part of the narrative. That's now really changing, and I think one of the really fascinating things is we are seeing a discernible fourth generation now that we can actually study. The great-grandchildren of immigrants whose Latinidad is changing, but I don't think that they're any less or any more Latino than those that are recently migrated. I think it's just part of this different ethnic curve that we're on in this country. So a lot of big changes, but there are certainly geographic and income and educational differences also. But at least to this point, it's generational differences that are the biggest demarcation point.
Folks, questions, line up, please. You also are so much of a pocho. You didn't talk about the actual Latinos who are here. Here in Santana, it's central and southern Mexico, Puebla, Michoacan, DF, way more of a radical, progressive legacy. In Anaheim, of course, we're all from Jalisco and Zacatecas. Rancho Libertarian Central, there's one guy right there. And your family, you know this, the land of alacranes, Durango and Sonora. So talk really briefly about that, just even where Latinos are coming from. Ecuadorians are going to vote differently from Venezuelans, obviously, but if someone from, say, El Salvador is going to be different from Costa Rica and vice versa.
So yeah, look, there's definitely it's the same way that regionally we can look and say whites in the Northeast are voting different than whites in the South, right? And we call them whites because that when 85% of your community is white, you're able to put these regional variations and these different cultural variations on top of them. That is changing as whites become a shrinking share of the vote. We're going to start hearing things like people saying whites are not monolithic. Whites are actually different. They don't vote as a bloc. And the same thing's happened, obviously, with Mexicanos. My people are a desert people. We're from Sonora and Durango. We're from the north. That defines that rancho libertarianism that you have talked about, I think, so very eloquently. It's in many ways, it's sort of it's the desert Southwest. It's like the Arizona independent streak that we've always identified with Goldwater and McCain and kind of the anti-establishment, but always there to help the community, right? There's a sense of helping each other out. Like, when you're out on the rancho and there's nobody else but 30 miles away, you don't just leave people onto their own, pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, but you damn well better be ready to prepare to take care of yourself in your own way, because otherwise you're going to end up dead. So that mindset, that culture over many centuries lasts with us. Go further down, as you were talking about, I think you put it well in your recent essay about, what would you say, the blood of revolutionaries from Guerrero.
Vaca,
Yeah, it's a beautiful essay. If you haven't read it, after you're done with my book, take a look at Gustavo's recent essay on Rancho Libertarianism. It's a really fascinating look at the Mexican spirit, Mexican differentiations, and I think in many ways it's a really apt comparison to what's happening with whites in this country by regional variations in culture.
No one reads me in Orange County, so it's not going to happen. Folks, don't be shy. There's a mic right there. Ask a question, yell it out. Here we are. I know you have questions. Lilia's going to say something. I'll restate it. Yeah, the question, and really a comment, was just, she went the same age as Mike, was in high school when Prop 187 happened, and her concern is that the younger generation, even if they're not born, they're not being taught about it. And then the people who lived through it are not telling the younger generation what exactly happened to it, and now she's seeing this generation really not caring about Trump's anti-immigrant attacks, J.D. Vance, all of this. My personal opinion, I'd love to hear you, it's not Mexicans who are coming across now. And I'm sorry, but Mexicans, when it's our cousins and ourselves that are crossing over, yeah, we're going to be out on the streets fighting against anti-immigrant nastiness. But when it's Central Americans and Venezuelans, we're like, who cares? It's nasty, but it's true.
Well, moreover, the biggest numbers crossing right now are Russians, Eastern Europeans, and Chinese. So we're even coming from the southern border, it's the whole conception of who's coming is very, very different now. But you used a very important word, understandably, which is they don't remember that. They weren't alive during that. We have to remember that and respect that their experience is completely different. Their generation is so dramatically more diverse than what we remember. I was talking to somebody earlier today. Back in the 90s, there were no Latina judges in Orange County. Today, there's 20. Like, that's their normal. And this younger generation of under 30 people, all they've known is a diverse society. So what was a big deal for us, like when I was growing up, is like every other day there'd be like a first city councilwoman here, Latina, first Orange County supervisor, Latino, first a state assembly member, first member of Congress. Like, these were big revolutionary moments. This is just normal to them. So their issue set has moved away from being an ethnic and racially focused voter to one which was more populist and pocketbook. And that's why they're like, yeah, Bernie Sanders sounds kind of good. Like this old, and Donald Trump, these 80-year-old white dudes who are like becoming like champions of the Latino cause, right? Because they're populists. Because they're the ones that are getting out there and saying, this is all just corrupt. It's a swamp. The system is rigged. The Democrats this isn't an honest primary. Donald Trump today is saying that at his rallies. Kamala Harris didn't get any votes. This is all rigged. It's all, that feeds into this cynical narrative that this young generation, this young non-white generation, is attracted to. And I think that it is one of the great ironies that while this younger generation does believe more in institutions broadly, there are two exceptions to that rule: the Republican and Democratic Party. And that is changing our political system. It's shaking the whole undercarriage of it, because populism is a defining feature of Latinos under 30. It's how you get a pro-burner city council. I don't know how old they are. Maybe they're younger. Yeah. So there you go. They're younger, and the younger our Latinos are, the more populist they are, the more anti-party they are. Latinos are the fastest group leaving both political parties. We have the weakest partisan anchors. So these older ideas of the Republican Party is the right party, or the Democratic Party is the right party, that's a relic of our generation, Gen X and older. It's quickly changing, and Latinos aren't buying it. Younger Latinos, which is the fastest growing, dramatic growth amongst our voter rolls, they're not buying it anymore.
Raise your hands, more questions. Oh, we have one right here, and then there's going to be one all the way in the back.
Great. Appreciate the conversation. I guess a couple of points you raised and related questions. What I'm hearing and what we all feel is, the Latino population is not a monolith. That said, and the political parties are pretending like we are. So my first question is there a strategy to engage the Latino community? What are the issues that we can rally around and exercise our power? Because I worry a little bit too much if you think we're not a monolith, are we too disconnected to be able to rally around? And the other point is, clearly both parties are all about institutional preservation. And so how do we organize to influence those parties? Since we're leaving, we're registering as independents, and as we do that, we don't have an ability to impact, what those platforms are and those conversational pieces. So how do we bring those points together?
Great questions, and they're a little bit intertwined. So let me kind of start here. We say, we're not monolithic here, and if I had $1 or a handful of pesos for every time I heard we're not monolithic, I'd be both a racist, as Gustavo just pointed out, but also very wealthy, because that's just, we've been hearing that for so long. But the truth is there are some common through lines. The main one is we are younger, we are far more working class, blue class than any other demographic, and that's enough to start developing a policy agenda on, candidly. Just for perspective, there's 65 million Latinos in America, about 20% of the overall population. 60% of those Latinos are Mexicano, Mexican-American descent. And it's not that 60% is so big, as I say, it's that every other group is so small. Puerto Ricans, who are Americans by birth, of course, are 9%. No other group hits double digits. El Salvadoreños are 7%, Cubans are 6%, and then down to the single digits. There's a fight for who's second, third, fourth, fifth. My point is, this is overwhelmingly a Mexican-American phenomenon, this transformation of the country. And that monolith also needs to recognize that. I mentioned earlier when we started, of the 7 battleground states, Latinos will be bigger in raw numbers than the margin of victory in all 7. In 6 of those 7, it's a Mexican-American vote. Pennsylvania is the only difference with Puerto Ricans, okay? So the through lines need to start speaking about a multi-ethnic working class agenda, and neither party is presenting that. The Democrats have a really, really, really tough time with the working class piece. You say that to Democrats and they want to light their hair on fire. How dare you? We're the party of Roosevelt. We got the unions, right? Latinos, by the way, have the lowest rate of unionization of any race or ethnicity in the country. And I'm not saying they're anti-union because they're not. It's just the nature of the economy is changing, okay? And Republicans have a struggle, candidly, with the multi-ethnic piece, but are getting more and more Latino voters despite their best efforts, not because of them, in most cases. So having said that, what does that mean? My argument is not with the Republican and Democratic parties, although I take them both to task in the book. My argument now is with Latino political leaders who are looking to the parties to solve our problems, which means they're looking to climb those ladders of power in order to get power. And as California is a perfect example, they're not doing anything with it to solve the damn problems once they get there. So I'm saying enough. Why don't we start having and demanding our leaders start solving the problems which are so obviously plaguing our community? And once you do that, the parties will come to us. That's the difference. Stop looking to the parties to solve the problems because they're never going to do it, ever.
Okay, one more question. Then after that, we're gonna talk about how these wonderful books are gonna be signed and put out there. Gentleman right there in the back, Please ask your question.
Good afternoon, Mike. I'm a retired educator,
Yeah.
and I wanted your input on the term Latin X. I say that because Gustavo teaches a history course called the Latin X History of Orange County.
Yeah.
LULAC has come out against it.
Yeah.
The National Hispanic Caucus has come out against it.
Yeah.
Real Academia Española, which oversees the Spanish language, has come out against it.
Uh-huh.
On a lower level, my tíos, my tías, my primos, my abuelos emphatically reject that term.
Yeah.
Why is it being thrust upon us?
Well, let me say this. I'm going to answer this as a political communicator, okay? You talk to people the way they want to be talked to. And in Pew Research, just came out last month, the number of Latinos who want to be called Latinx has doubled to 4%, okay? But I really take umbrage with the fact that we are using a political attack to try to speak to people where they're at. If you feel that Latinx as a term is being thrust upon you, brother, we need to have coffee and talk, because there's so many other real issues that are being thrust upon you that we should be focused on that really matter more. And to me, that term has been used by, it's a symbol of our cultural dysfunction, that both sides have this desperate need to make this a punching bag of sorts. I write in the book about the term Chicano. In many ways, it was derided the same way. It was a people struggling to find a word to define their unique experience. And my father rejected that. He didn't want us calling ourselves Chicanos, but as I've matured and grown into it and realized what that experience is, call yourself whatever you want to call yourself, and I'll do my level best to acknowledge that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a healthy part of pluralism. So I don't have any issue. I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times about it, saying, I think this does show cultural alienation. I think that the fact that white progressives use the term far more than Latinos do is a sign of how far removed they are from our community. Does that make it inherently bad? No. It means it's an attempt to use language to describe something that we have really just come to learn to accept and identify. I don't use it. I don't go by it. If somebody does, I'm not going to go out of my way to not use it, because it's just a sign to me of these small peripheral, non-important things that we politicize for the sake of looking for a fight. It's my opinion.
You know what term was also thrust upon us? Hispanic. It was literally created, or literally made law by a group of Latinos shoved into a room during the Ford administration.
Yeah.
They told them, hey, figure out a term to call them or yourselves.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Thrust. Anyways, language, politics, Moore Park. Mike Madrid's book, I tell you to buy it, but most of you are going to get this for free. Round of applause for Mike again, one more time. He is going to be signing.